David Carter stepped into the office lobby with a calm confidence, his tailored suit catching the glow of the morning light. What should have been an ordinary day took an extraordinary turn when the secretary, Sophie, locked eyes with him and tightened her grip on the phone, her expression shifting from polite to piercing suspicion. Her decision was instant. Without a second thought, she leaned toward the security guard and whispered, "We've got a situation here." This is the kind of story that cuts deep, brought to you by Real Life Stories New, where moments of truth redefine how we see the world. For David, a man who had built this company from the ground up, the cold skepticism in Sophie's voice wasn't just an insult, it was a gut-wrenching reminder of the prejudice he had battled his entire life. "Who are you, and how did you get in here?" Sophie demanded, her words laced with disbelief. David calmly introduced himself as the owner, but her eyes only narrowed further, her doubt transforming into a hardened resolve to prove him wrong. When the security guard moved to block his path, shoving him toward the exit, David's hands clenched tightly at his sides, not in fear, but in restraint. He could have raised his voice, called for a manager, or revealed his identity with force, but he chose a different path. In that moment, the humiliation burned hot, but the resolve in his heart burned hotter. The office staff watched in stunned silence, some curious, others complicit, as this showdown unfolded. What happened next, a revelation that would shake the entire office, left Sophie and the guard scrambling for words and shattered their illusions about who David Carter really was. Stay with us as Real Life Stories New uncovers this powerful moment of reckoning, where one man's quiet strength exposes the deep-rooted biases hiding in plain sight. David Carter stood tall, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. He had faced challenges before, but there was something uniquely painful about being questioned in a place he had built from scratch. Sophie's piercing glare followed him as he approached her desk, her polished demeanor giving way to an air of rigid authority. "Excuse me, I'm David Carter," he began, his voice even but firm. "I'm here for a meeting." Her fingers paused mid-type, and she looked up slowly, her brows furrowing. "I don't see your name on the list," she replied curtly, her tone sharp enough to cut through the tension hanging in the room. Her disbelief wasn't subtle, it was written all over her face, as if his presence was a challenge to the order of her world. David's chest tightened, but he refused to let frustration surface. "I don't need to be on a list," he said evenly. "I'm the owner of this company." For a moment, silence stretched between them, and David thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But then she laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet office. "The owner," she repeated, her voice laced with mockery. "You can't expect me to believe that." Her words stung, but David held his ground. "Check my ID," he said, extending it toward her. Sophie didn't even glance at it. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze flickering to the security guard stationed nearby. A silent command passed between them, and the guard stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow over David. "Let me see that," the guard growled, snatching the ID from David's hand. He examined it briefly before handing it back with a sneer. "This doesn't prove anything," he muttered. "You need to leave." David took a step back, his heart pounding. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This is my company. I don't need your permission to be here." But Sophie wasn't listening. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "If you don't leave now," she warned, "I'll call the police. And don't think a fake ID will save you." The accusation was a slap to the face, but David's composure didn't waver. He squared his shoulders, meeting her gaze head-on. "Is this how you treat all visitors?" he asked, his tone cutting through her confidence. "Or just the ones who look like me?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she gestured toward the guard, who grabbed David's arm roughly. "Let's go," the guard barked, his voice full of hostility. The shove was hard enough to make David stumble, but he quickly regained his footing. His fists clenched at his sides, the temptation to retaliate flashing briefly in his mind. But he knew that giving in to anger wouldn't change anything. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the office staff. Some avoided his gaze, while others stared, their expressions ranging from smug amusement to unease. Not a single person spoke up. David felt the weight of their silence pressing down on him, but he refused to let it crush his resolve. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice ringing out clearly. "This is about every person you've dismissed because of your own assumptions." At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Heads turned as a group of managers stepped off the elevator, their faces etched with concern. One of them, a tall man in a crisp suit, hurried forward. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Sophie straightened, her confidence seemingly restored. "This man was trying to enter without permission," she said, her tone dismissive. "He claims he's the owner." The manager's eyes shifted to David, and in an instant, his expression changed. "Mr. Carter?" he asked, his voice faltering. "Is it really you?" David adjusted his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yes," he replied, his tone calm but heavy with meaning. "It's me." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie froze, her face draining of color as realization hit. The guard stepped back hastily, his earlier bravado vanishing. Around the room, whispers began to spread, the weight of the truth settling like a heavy fog over the office. The manager stammered an apology, but David barely heard him. His focus was on Sophie, whose confident veneer had crumbled into a mask of regret. For the first time, she seemed truly unsure of herself, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find the right words. David didn't need to say much. His presence alone had already rewritten the narrative Sophie and the guard had crafted. The moment was a quiet triumph, but the sting of humiliation lingered, a reminder of the prejudice he had just endured. David stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding a silence that felt heavier than words could fill. His gaze swept across the office, taking in the faces of those who had chosen to watch rather than act, their discomfort now visible. Sophie's apology trembled in the air, but David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the moment sink in for everyone, including himself. "This isn't just about me," David finally said, his voice steady but laced with quiet emotion. "It's about how easily we let assumptions shape our actions. Today, I was judged not for who I am, but for what others thought I couldn't be." His words hung in the air, leaving a profound stillness in their wake. Sophie's face flushed with shame, and the guard shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado replaced by regret. The office staff looked down, some visibly grappling with the realization of their complicity. For David, this was more than just vindication, it was an opportunity to challenge the prejudices that often go unchecked. Turning back to Sophie, David's tone softened, but his words carried weight. "The real work begins when we choose to see beyond our biases," he said. "I hope this moment stays with you, not as a mark of shame, but as a chance to grow." With that, David adjusted his suit and walked away, his stride steady, leaving behind a room filled with reflection and unanswered questions. It wasn't a victory parade, it was a quiet, powerful statement of dignity and grace. This story reminds us that change starts with accountability, and it's up to us to create a world where everyone is seen for their potential, not their appearance. If this message resonated with you, help us spread stories like this by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Real Life Stories New. Let's work together to reach 10,000 subscribers and keep these powerful lessons alive.